Chapter 34. But the resources of Clyde, in such a situation as this, were slim. For, apart from Liggett, Wiggam, and a few minor though decidedly pleasant and yet rather remote department heads, all of whom were now looking on him as a distinctly superior person who could scarcely be approached too familiarly in connection with anything, there was no one to whom he could appeal. In so far as the social group to which he was now so eagerly attaching himself was concerned, it would have been absurd for him to attempt, however slyly, to extract any information there. For while the youths of this world at least were dashing here and there, and because of their looks, taste and means indulging themselves in phases of libertinism, the proper wild oats of youth, such as he and others like himself could not have dreamed of affording, still so far was he from any real intimacy with any of these that he would not have dreamed of approaching them for helpful information. His sanest thought, which occurred to him almost immediately after leaving Roberta, was that instead of inquiring of any druggist or doctor or person in Lycurgus, more particularly any doctor, since the entire medical profession here, as elsewhere, appeared to him as remote, cold, unsympathetic and likely very expensive and unfriendly to such an immoral adventure as this, was to go to some nearby city, preferably Schenectady, since it was larger and as near as any, and there inquire what, if anything, could be obtained to help in such a situation as this. For he must find something. At the same time, the necessity for decision and prompt action was so great that even on his way to the Starks, and without knowing any drug or prescription to ask for, he resolved to go to Schenectady the next night. Only that meant, as he later reasoned, that a whole day must elapse before anything could be done for Roberta, and that, in her eyes, as well as his own, would be leaving her open to the danger that any delay at all involved. Therefore, he decided to act at once, if he could, excuse himself to the Starks and then make the trip to Schenectady on the interurban before the drug stores over there should close. But once there, what? How face the local druggist or clerk, and ask for what? His mind was troubled with hard, abrasive thoughts as to what the druggist might think, look or say. If only Ratterer or Helland were here. They would know, of course, and be glad to help him. Or Higby, even. But here he was now, all alone, for Roberta knew nothing at all. There must be something though, of course. If not, if he failed there, he would return and write Ratterer in Chicago, only in order to keep himself out of this as much as possible he would say that he was writing for a friend. Once in Schenectady, since no one knew him there, of course he might say, the thought came to him as an inspiration, that he was a newly married man. Why not? He was old enough to be one, and that his wife, and that in the face of inability to care for a child now, was past her time. He recalled a phrase that he had once heard Higby use, and that he wanted something that would permit her to escape from that state. What was so wrong with that as an idea? A young married couple might be in just such a predicament. And possibly the druggist would, or should be stirred to a little sympathy by such a state and might be glad to tell him of something. Why not? That would be no real crime. To be sure, one and another might refuse, but a third might not. And then he would be rid of this. And then never again, without knowing a lot more than he did now, would he let himself drift into any such predicament as this. Never. It was too dreadful. He betook himself to the Stark house very nervous and growing more so every moment. So much so that, the dinner being eaten, he finally declared as early as 9:30 that at the last moment at the factory a very troublesome report, covering a whole month's activities, had been requested of him. And since it was not anything he could do at the office, he was compelled to return to his room and make it out there, a bit of energetic and ambitious commercialism, as the Starks saw it, worthy of their admiration and sympathy. And in consequence he was excused. But arrived at Schenectady, he had barely time to look around a little before the last car for Lycurgus should be leaving. His nerve began to fail him. Did he look enough like a young married man to convince anyone that he was one? Besides, were not such preventatives considered very wrong, even by druggists? walking up and down the one very long main street still brightly lighted at this hour, looking now in one drugstore window and another. He decided for different reasons that each particular one was not the one. In one, as he saw at a glance, stood a stout, sober, smooth-shaven man of 50 whose bespectacled eyes and iron-gray hair seemed to indicate to Clyde's mind that he would be most certain to deny such a youthful applicant as himself, refuse to believe that he was married, or to admit that he had any such remedy, and suspect him of illicit relations with some young, unmarried girl into the bargain. He looked so sober, God-fearing, ultra-respectable and conventional. No, it would not do to apply to him. He had not the courage to enter and face such a person. In another drugstore he observed a small, shriveled and yet dapper and shrewd-looking man of perhaps 35, who appeared to him at the time as satisfactory enough, only, as he could see from the front, he was being briskly assisted by a young woman of not more than 20 or 25. And assuming that she would approach him instead of the man, an embarrassing and impossible situation, or if the man waited on him, was it not probable that she would hear? In consequence he gave up that place, and a third, a fourth, and a fifth, for varying and yet equally cogent reasons, customers inside, a girl and a boy at a soda fountain in front. An owner posed near the door and surveying Clyde as he looked in and thus disconcerting him before he had time to consider whether he should enter or not. Finally, however, after having abandoned so many, he decided that he must act or return defeated, his time and car fare wasted. Returning to one of the lesser stores in a side street, in which a moment before he had observed an undersized chemist idling about, he entered, and summoning all the bravado he could muster, began, "I want to know something. I want to know if you know of anything. Well, you see, it's this way, I'm just married and my wife is past her time and I can't afford to have any children now if I can help it. Is there anything a person can get that will get her out of it?" His manner was brisk and confidential enough, although tinged with nervousness and the inner conviction that the druggist must guess that he was lying. At the same time, although he did not know it, he was talking to a confirmed religionist of the Methodist group who did not believe in interfering with the motives or impulses of nature. Any such trifling was against the laws of God and he carried nothing in stock that would in any way interfere with the ways of the Creator. At the same time he was too good a merchant to wish to alienate a possible future customer, and so he now said, "I'm sorry, young man, but I'm afraid I can't help you in this case. I haven't a thing of that kind in stock here, never handle anything of that kind because I don't believe in 'em. It may be, though, that some of the other stores here in town carry something of the sort. I wouldn't be able to tell you." His manner as he spoke was solemn, the convinced and earnest tone and look of the moralist who knows that he is right. And at once Clyde gathered, and fairly enough in this instance, that this man was reproachful. It reduced to a much smaller quantity the little confidence with which he had begun his quest. And yet, since the dealer had not directly reproached him and had even said that it might be possible that some of the other druggists carried such a thing, he took heart after a few moments, and after a brief fit of pacing here and there in which he looked through one window and another, he finally espied a seventh dealer alone. He entered, and after repeating his first explanation he was informed, very secretively and yet casually, by the thin, dark, casuistic person who waited on him, not the owner in this instance, that there was such a remedy. Yes. Did he wish a box? That, because Clyde asked the price, would be $6, a staggering sum to the salaried inquirer. However, since the expenditure seemed unescapable, to find anything at all a great relief, he at once announced that he would take it, and the clerk, bringing him something which he hinted ought to prove effectual and wrapping it up, he paid and went out. And then actually so relieved was he, so great had been the strain up to this moment, that he could have danced for joy. Then there was a cure, and it would work, of course. The excessive and even outrageous price seemed to indicate as much. And under the circumstances, might he not even consider that sum moderate, seeing that he was being let off so easily? However, he forgot to inquire as to whether there was any additional information or special direction that might prove valuable, and instead, with the package in his pocket, some central and detached portion of the ego within himself congratulating him upon his luck and undaunted efficiency in such a crisis as this, he at once returned to Lycurgus, where he proceeded to Roberta's room. And she, like himself, impressed by his success in having secured something which both he and she had feared did not exist, or if it did, might prove difficult to procure, felt enormously relieved. In fact, she was impressed by his ability and efficiency, qualities with which, up to this time at least, she had endowed him. Also that he was more generous and considerate than under the circumstances she feared he would be. At least he was not coldly abandoning her to fate, as previously in her terror she had imagined that he might. And this fact, even in the face of his previous indifference, was sufficient to soften her mood in regard to him. So with a kind of ebullience, based on fattened hope resting on the pills, she undid the package and read the directions, assuring him the while of her gratitude and that she would not forget how good he had been to her in this instance. At the same time, even as she untied the package, the thought came to her, supposing they would not work? Then what? And how would she go about arranging with Clyde as to that? However, for the time being, as she now reasoned, she must be satisfied and grateful for this, and at once took one of the pills. But once her expressions of gratefulness had been offered and Clyde sensed that these same might possibly be looked upon as overtures to a new intimacy between them, he fell back upon the attitude that for days past had characterized him at the factory. Under no circumstances must he lend himself to any additional blandishments or languishments in this field. And if this drug proved effectual, as he most earnestly hoped, it must be the last of any save the most accidental and casual contacts. For there was too much danger, as this particular crisis had proved, too much to be lost on his side, everything, in short, nothing but worry and trouble and expense. In consequence he retreated to his former reserve. "Well, you'll be all right now, eh? Anyhow, let's hope so, huh? It says to take one every 2 hours for 8 or 10 hours. And if you're just a little sick, it says it doesn't make any difference. You may have to knock off a day or 2 at the factory, but you won't mind that, will you, if it gets you out of this? I'll come around tomorrow night and see how you are, if you don't show up any time tomorrow." He laughed genially, the while Roberta gazed at him, unable to associate his present casual attitude with his former passion and deep solicitude. His former passion. And now this. And yet, under the circumstances, being truly grateful, she now smiled cordially and he the same. Yet, seeing him go out, the door close, and no endearing demonstrations of any kind having been exchanged between them, she returned to her bed, shaking her head dubiously. For, supposing that this remedy did not work after all? And he continued in this same casual and remote attitude toward her? Then what? For unless this remedy proved effectual, he might still be so indifferent that he might not want to help her long, or would he? Could he do that, really? He was the one who had brought her to this difficulty, and against her will, and he had so definitely assured her that nothing would happen. And now she must lie here alone and worry, not a single person to turn to, except him, and he was leaving her for others with the assurance that she would be all right. And he had caused it all. Was this quite right? Oh, Clyde. Clyde. Chapter 35. But the remedy he purchased failed to work. And because of nausea and his advice she had not gone to the factory, but lay about worrying. But, no saving result appearing, she began to take 2 pills every hour instead of 1, eager at any cost to escape the fate which seemingly had overtaken her. And this made her exceedingly sick, so much so that when Clyde arrived at 6:30 he was really moved by her deathly white face, drawn cheeks and large and nervous eyes, the pupils of which were unduly dilated. Obviously she was facing a crisis, and because of him, and, while it frightened, at the same time it made him sorry for her. Still, So confused and perplexed was he by the problem which her unchanged state presented to him that his mind now leaped forward to the various phases and eventualities of such a failure as this. The need of additional advice or service of some physician somewhere. But where and how and who? And besides, as he now asked himself, where was he to obtain the money in any such event? Plainly, in view of no other inspiration, it was necessary for him to return to the druggist at once and there inquire if there was anything else, some other drug or some other thing that one might do. Or if not that, then some low-priced shady doctor somewhere, who, for a small fee, or a promise of payments on time, would help in this case. Yet even though this other matter was so important, tragic almost, once outside his spirits lifted slightly. For he now recalled that he had an appointment with Sandra at the Cranstons, where at 9 he and she, along with a number of others, were to meet and play about as usual, a party. Yet once at the Cranstons, and despite the keen allurement of Sandra, he could not keep his mind off Roberta's state, which rose before him as a spectre. Supposing now any one of those whom he found gathered here, Nadine Harriet, Pearlie Haynes, Violet Taylor, Jill Trumbull, Bella, Bertine, and Sandra, should gain the least inkling of the scene he had just witnessed? In spite of Sandra at the piano throwing him a welcoming smile over her shoulder as he entered, his thoughts were on Roberta. He must go around there again after this was over, to see how she was and so relieve his own mind in case she were better. In case she was not, he must write to Ratterer at once for advice. In spite of his distress, he was trying to appear as gay and unconcerned as ever, dancing first with Pearlie Haynes and then with Nadine, and finally, while waiting for a chance to dance with Sandra, he approached a group who were trying to help Vanda Steele solve a new scenery puzzle and asserted that he could read messages written on paper and sealed in envelopes, the old serial letter trick which he had found explained in an ancient book of parlor tricks discovered on a shelf at the Paytons. It had been his plan to use it before in order to give himself an air of ease and cleverness, but tonight he was using it to take his mind off the greater problem that was weighing on him. And, although with the aid of Nadine Harriet, whom he took into his confidence, he succeeded in thoroughly mystifying the others, still his mind was not quite on it. Roberta was always there. Supposing something should really be wrong with her and he could not get her out of it. She might even expect him to marry her, so fearful was she of her parents and people. What would he do then? He would lose the beautiful Sandra and she might even come to know how and why he had lost her. But that would be wild of Roberta to expect him to do that. He would not do it. He could not do it. One thing was certain. He must get her out of this. He must. But how? How? And although at 12 o'clock Sandra signaled that she was ready to go and that if he chose he might accompany her to her door, and even stop in for a few moments, and although once there, in the shade of a pergola which ornamented the front gate, she had allowed him to kiss her and told him that she was beginning to think he was the nicest ever and that the following spring when the family moved to 12th Lake she was going to see if she couldn't think of some way by which she could arrange to have him there over weekends, still, because of this pressing problem in connection with Roberta, Clyde was so worried that he was not able to completely enjoy this new and to him exquisitely thrilling demonstration of affection on her part, this new and amazing social and emotional victory of his. He must send that letter to Ratterer tonight. But before that he must return to Roberta as he had promised and find out if she was better. And after that he must go over to Schenectady in the morning, sure, to see the druggist over there. For something must be done about this unless she were better tonight. And so, with Sandra's kisses thrilling on his lips, he left her to go to Roberta, whose white face and troubled eyes told him as he entered her room that no change had taken place. If anything, she was worse and more distressed than before, the larger dosage having weakened her to the point of positive illness. However, as she said, nothing mattered if only she could get out of this, that she would almost be willing to die rather than face the consequences. And Clyde, realizing what she meant and being so sincerely concerned for himself, appeared in part distressed for her. However, His previous indifference and the manner in which he had walked off and left her alone this very evening prevented her from feeling that there was any abiding concern in him for her now. And this grieved her terribly. For she sensed now that he did not really care for her anymore, even though now he was saying that she mustn't worry and that it was likely that if these didn't work he would get something else that would. That he was going back to the druggist at Schenectady the first thing in the morning to see if there wasn't something else that he could suggest. But the Gilpins had no telephone, and since he never ventured to call at her room during the day and he never permitted her to call him at Mrs. Peyton's, his plan in this instance was to pass by the following morning before work. If she were all right, the two front shades would be raised to the top; if not, then lowered to the center. In that case he would depart for Schenectady at once, telephoning Mr. Liggett that he had some outside duties to perform. Just the same, both were terribly depressed and fearful as to what this should mean for each of them. Clyde could not quite assure himself that, in the event that Roberta was not extricated, he would be able to escape without indemnifying her in some form, which might not mean just temporary efforts to aid her, but something more, marriage, possibly, since already she had reminded him that he had promised to see her through. But what had he really meant by that at the time that he said it, he now asked himself. Not marriage, most certainly, since his thought was not that he had ever wanted to marry her, but rather just to play with her happily in love, although, as he well knew, she had no such conception of his eager mood at that time. He was compelled to admit to himself that she had probably thought his intentions were more serious or she would not have submitted to him at all. But reaching home, and after writing and mailing the letter to Ratterer, Clyde passed a troubled night. Next morning he paid a visit to the druggist at Schenectady, the curtains of Roberta's windows having been lowered to the center when he passed. But on this occasion the latter had no additional aid to offer other than the advisability of a hot and hence weakening bath, which he had failed to mention in the first instance. Also some wearying form of physical exercise. But noting Clyde's troubled expression and judging that the situation was causing him great worry, he observed, "Of course, the fact that your wife has skipped a month doesn't mean that there is anything seriously wrong, you know. Women do that sometimes. Anyhow, you can't ever be sure until the second month has passed. Any doctor will tell you that. If she's nervous, let her try something like this. But even if it fails to work, you can't be positive. She might be all right next month just the same." Thinly cheered by this information, Clyde was about to depart, for Roberta might be wrong. He and she might be worrying needlessly. Still, he was brought up with a round turn as he thought of it. There might be real danger, and waiting until the end of the second period would only mean that a whole month had elapsed and nothing helpful accomplished, a freezing thought. In consequence he now observed, in case things don't come right, you don't happen to know of a doctor she could go to, do you? This is rather a serious business for both of us, and I'd like to get her out of it if I could." Something about the way in which Clyde said this, his extreme nervousness as well as his willingness to indulge in a form of malpractice which the pharmacist by some logic all his own considered very different from just swallowing a preparation intended to achieve the same result, caused him to look suspiciously at Clyde, the thought stirring in his brain that very likely after all Clyde was not married, also that this was one of those youthful affairs which spelled license and future difficulty for some unsophisticated girl. Hence his mood now changed, and instead of being willing to assist, he now said coolly, "Well, there may be a doctor around here, but if so I don't know. And I wouldn't undertake to send anyone to a doctor like that. It's against the law. It would certainly go hard with any doctor around here who was caught doing that sort of thing. That's not to say, though, that you aren't at liberty to look around for yourself, if you want to," he added gravely, giving Clyde a suspicious and examining glance, and deciding it were best if he had nothing further to do with such a person. Clyde therefore returned to Roberta with the same prescription renewed, although she had most decidedly protested that, since the first box had not worked, it was useless to get more. But since he insisted, she was willing to try the drug the new way, although the argument that a cold or nerves was the possible cause was only sufficient to convince her that Clyde was at the end of his resources insofar as she was concerned, or if not that, he was far from being alive to the import of this both to herself and to him. And supposing this new treatment did not work, then what? Was he going to stop now and let the thing rest there? Yet so peculiar was Clyde's nature that in the face of his fears in regard to his future, and because it was far from pleasant to be harried in this way and an infringement on his other interests, the assurance that the delay of a month might not prove fatal was sufficient to cause him to be willing to wait, and that rather indifferently, for that length of time. Roberta might be wrong. She might be making all this trouble for nothing. He must see how she felt after she had tried this new way. But the treatment failed. Despite the fact that in her distress Roberta returned to the factory in order to weary herself, until all the girls in the department assured her that she must be ill, that she should not be working when she looked and plainly felt so bad, still nothing came of it. And the fact that Clyde could dream of falling back on the assurance of the druggist that a first month's lapse was of no import only aggravated and frightened her the more. The truth was that in this crisis he was as interesting an illustration of the enormous handicaps imposed by ignorance, youth, poverty and fear as one could have found. Technically he did not even know the meaning of the word midwife, or the nature of the services performed by her. And there were 3 here in Lycurgus at this time in the foreign family section. Again, he had been in Lycurgus so short a time, and apart from the young society men and Dillard whom he had cut, and the various department heads at the factory, he knew no one, an occasional barber, haberdasher, cigar dealer and the like, the majority of whom, as he saw them, were either too dull or too ignorant for his purpose. One thing, however, which caused him to pause before ever he decided to look up a physician was the problem of who was to approach him and how. To go himself was simply out of the question. In the first place, he looked too much like Gilbert Griffiths, who was decidedly too well known here and for whom he might be mistaken. Next, it was unquestionable that, being as well dressed as he was, the physician would want to charge him more, maybe, than he could afford and ask him all sorts of embarrassing questions, whereas if it could be arranged through someone else, the details explained before ever Roberta was sent, why not Roberta herself? Why not? She looked so simple and innocent and unassuming and appealing at all times. And in such a situation as this, as depressed and downcast as she was, well. For after all, as he now casuistically argued with himself, it was she and not he who was facing the immediate problem which had to be solved. And again, as it now came to him, would she not be able to get it done cheaper? For looking as she did now, so distrait, if only he could get her to say that she had been deserted by some young man, whose name she would refuse to divulge, of course, well, what physician seeing a girl like her alone and in such a state, no one to look after her, would refuse her? It might even be that he would help her out for nothing. Who could tell? And that would leave him clear of it all. And in consequence he now approached Roberta, intending to prepare her for the suggestion that, assuming that he could provide a physician and the nature of his position being what it was, she must speak for herself. But before he had spoken she at once inquired of him as to what, if anything, more he had heard or done. Wasn't some other remedy sold somewhere? And this giving him the opportunity he desired, he explained, well, I've asked around and looked into most of the drug stores and they tell me if this one won't work that none will. That leaves me sorta stumped now, unless you're willing to go and see a doctor. But the trouble with that is they're hard to find, the ones who'll do anything and keep their mouths shut. I've talked with several fellows without saying who it's for, of course, but it ain't so easy to get one around here, because they are all too much afraid. It's against the law, you see. But what I want to know now is, supposing I find a doctor who would do it, will you have the nerve to go and see him and tell him what the trouble is? That's what I want to know. She looked at him dazedly, not quite grasping that he was hinting that she was to go entirely alone, but rather assuming that of course he meant to go with her. Then, her mind concentrating nervously upon the necessity of facing a doctor in his company, She first exclaimed, "Oh, dear, isn't it terrible to think of us having to go to a doctor in this way? Then he'll know all about us, won't he? And besides, it's dangerous, isn't it? Although I don't suppose it could be much worse than those old pills." She went off into more intimate inquiries as to what was done and how, but Clyde could not enlighten her. "Oh, don't be getting nervous over that now," he said. "It isn't anything that's going to hurt you, I know. Besides, we'll be lucky if we find someone to do it. What I want to know is, if I do find a doctor, will you be willing to go to him alone?" She started as if struck, but unabashed now he went on, "As things stand with me here, I can't go with you, that's sure. I'm too well known around here, and besides I look too much like Gilbert and he's known to everybody. If I should be mistaken for him, or be taken for his cousin or a relative, well, then the jig's up." His eyes were not only an epitome of how wretched he would feel were he exposed to all Lycurgus for what he was, but also in them lurked a shadow of the shabby role he was attempting to play in connection with her, in hiding thus completely behind her necessity. And yet so tortured was he by the fear of what was about to befall him in case he did not succeed in so doing, that he was now prepared, whatever Roberta might think or say, to stand his ground. But Roberta, sensing only the fact that he was thinking of sending her alone, now exclaimed incredulously, "Not alone, Clyde. Oh, no, I couldn't do that. Oh, dear, no. Why, I'd be frightened to death. Oh, dear, no. Why, I'd be so frightened I wouldn't know what to do. Just think how I'd feel, trying to explain to him alone. I just couldn't do that. Besides, how would I know what to say, how to begin? You'll just have to go with me at first, that's all, and explain, or I never can go. I don't care what happens." Her eyes were round and excited, and her face, while registering all the depression and fear that had recently been there, was transfigured by definite opposition. But Clyde was not to be shaken either. "You know how it is with me here, Bert. I can't go, and that's all there is to it. Why, supposing I were seen, supposing someone should recognize me. What then? You know how much I've been going around here since I've been here. Why, it's crazy to think that I could go. Besides, it will be a lot easier for you than for me. No doctor's going to think anything much of your coming to him, especially if you're alone. He'll just think you're someone who's got in trouble and with no one to help you. But if I go, and it should be anyone who knows anything about the Griffiths, there'd be the deuce to pay. Right off he'd think I was stuffed with money. Besides, if I didn't do just what he wanted me to do afterwards, he could go to my uncle, or my cousin, and then, good night. That would be the end of me. And if I lost my place here now, and with no money and that kind of scandal connected with me, where do you suppose I would be after that, or you either? I certainly couldn't look after you then. And then what would you do? I should think you'd wake up and see what a tough proposition this is. My name can't be pulled into this without trouble for both of us. It's got to be kept out, that's all, and the only way for me to keep it out is for me to stay away from any doctor. Besides, he'd feel a lot sorrier for you than he would for me. You can't tell me." His eyes were distressed and determined, and, as Roberta could gather from his manner, a certain hardness, or at least defiance, the result of fright, showed in every gesture. He was determined to protect his own name, come what might, a fact which, because of her own acquiescence up to this time, still carried great weight with her. "Oh, dear! Dear!" she exclaimed, nervously and sadly now, the growing and drastic terror of the situation dawning upon her. "I don't see how we are to do then. I really don't. For I can't do that, and that's all there is to it. It's all so hard, so terrible. I'd feel too much ashamed and frightened to ever go alone." But even as she said this she began to feel that she might, and even would, go alone, if must be. For what else was there to do? And how was she to compel him, in the face of his own fears and dangers, to jeopardize his position here? He began once more, in self-defense more than from any other motive. "Besides, Unless this thing isn't going to cost very much, I don't see how I'm going to get by with it anyhow, Bert. I really don't. I don't make so very much, you know, only $25 up to now. Necessity was at last compelling him to speak frankly with Roberta, and I haven't saved anything, not a cent. And you know why as well as I do. We spent the most of it together. Besides, if I go and he thought I had money, he might want to charge me more than I could possibly dig up. But if you go and just tell him how things are, and that you haven't got anything, if you'd only say I'd run away or something, see, he paused because, as he said it, he saw a flicker of shame, contempt, despair at being connected with anything so cheap and shabby, pass over Roberta's face. And yet in spite of this sly and yet muddy tergiversation on his part, so great is the compelling and enlightening power of necessity, she could still see that there was some point to his argument. He might be trying to use her as a foil, a mask, behind which he, and she too for that matter, was attempting to hide. But just the same, shameful as it was, here were the stark, bald headlands of fact, and at their base the thrashing, destroying waves of necessity. She heard him say, "You wouldn't have to give your right name, you know, or where you came from. I don't intend to pick out any doctor right around here, see? Then, if you'd tell him you didn't have much money, just your weekly salary." She sat down weakly to think, the while this persuasive trickery proceeded from him, the import of most of his argument going straight home. For as false and morally meretricious as this whole plan was, still, as she could see for herself, her own as well as Clyde's situation was desperate. And as honest and punctilious as she might ordinarily be in the matter of truth-telling and honest dealing, plainly this was one of those whirling tempests of fact and reality in which the ordinary charts and compasses of moral measurement were for the time being of small use. And so, insisting then that they go to some doctor far away, Utica or Albany, maybe, but still admitting by this that she would go, the conversation was dropped. And he, having triumphed in the matter of accepting his own personality from this, took heart to the extent, at least, of thinking that at once now, by some hook or crook, he must find a doctor to whom he could send her. Then his terrible troubles in connection with all this would be over. And after that she could go her way, as surely she must, then, seeing that he would have done all that he could for her, he would go his way to the glorious denouement that lay directly before him in case only this were adjusted. Chapter 36. Nevertheless, hours and even days, and finally a week and then 10 days, passed without any word from him as to the whereabouts of a doctor to whom she could go. For although having said so much to her, he still did not know to whom to apply. And each hour and day as great a menace to him as to her. And her looks as well as her inquiries registering how intense and vital and even clamorous at moments was her own distress. Also he was harried almost to the point of nervous collapse by his own inability to think of any speedy and sure way by which she might be aided. Where did a physician live to whom he might send her with some assurance of relief for her, and how was he to find out about him? After a time, however, in running over all the names of those he knew, he finally struck upon a forlorn hope in the guise of Orrin Short, the young man conducting the one small gents' furnishing store in Lycurgus, which catered more or less exclusively to the rich youths of the city, a youth of about his own years and proclivities, as Clyde had guessed, who ever since he had been here had been useful to him in the matter of tips as to dress and style in general. Indeed, as Clyde had for some time noted, Short was a brisk, inquiring and tactful person, who, in addition to being quite attractive personally to girls, was also always most courteous to his patrons, particularly to those whom he considered above him in the social scale, and among these was Clyde. For having discovered that Clyde was related to the Griffiths, this same Short had sought, as a means for his own general advancement in other directions, to scrape as much of a genial and intimate relationship with him as possible, only, as Clyde saw it, and in view of the general attitude of his very high relatives, it had not, up to this time at least, been possible for him to consider any such intimacy seriously. And yet, finding Short so very affable and helpful in general, he was not above reaching at least an easy and genial surface relationship with him, which Short appeared to accept in good part. Indeed, as at first, his manner remained seeking and not a little sycophantic at times. And so it was that among all those with whom he could be said to be in either intimate or casual contact, Short was about the only one who offered even a chance for an inquiry which might prove productive of some helpful information. In consequence, in passing Short's place each evening and morning, once he thought of him in this light, he made it a point to nod and smile in a most friendly manner, until at least 3 days had gone by. And then, feeling that he had paved the way as much as his present predicament would permit, he stopped in, not at all sure that on this first occasion he would be able to broach the dangerous subject. The tale he had fixed upon to tell Short was that he had been approached by a young working man in the factory, newly married, who, threatened with an heir and not being able to afford one as yet, had appealed to him for information as to where he might now find a doctor to help him. The only interesting additions which Clyde proposed to make to this were that the young man, being very poor and timid and not so very intelligent, was not able to speak or do much for himself. Also that he, Clyde, being better informed, although so new locally as not to be able to direct him to any physician, an afterthought intended to put the idea into Short's mind that he himself was never helpless and so not likely ever to want such advice himself, had already advised the young man of a temporary remedy. But unfortunately, so his story was to run, this had already failed to work. Hence something more certain, a physician, no less, was necessary. And Short, having been here longer, and, as he had heard him explain, hailing previously from Gloversville, it was quite certain, as Clyde now argued with himself, that he would know of at least one, or should. But in order to divert suspicion from himself he was going to add that of course he probably could get news of someone in his own set, only, the situation being so unusual, any reference to any such thing in his own world being likely to set his own group talking, he preferred to ask someone like Short, who as a favor would keep it quiet. As it chanced on this occasion, Short himself, owing to his having done a very fair day's business, was in an exceedingly jovial frame of mind. And Clyde having entered, to buy a pair of socks, perhaps, he began, "Well, it's good to see you again, Mr. Griffiths. How are you? I was just thinking it's about time you stopped in and let me show you some of the things I got in since you were here before. How are things with the Griffiths company anyhow?" Short's manner, always brisk, was on this occasion doubly reassuring, since he liked Clyde, only now the latter was so intensely keyed up by the daring of his own project that he could scarcely bring himself to carry the thing off with the air he would have liked to have employed. Nevertheless, being in the store and so, seemingly, committed to the project, he now began, "Oh, pretty fair. Can't kick a bit. I always have all I can do, you know." At the same time he began nervously fingering some ties hung upon movable nickeled rods. But before he had wasted a moment on these, Mr. Short, turning and spreading some boxes of very special ties from a shelf behind him on the glass case, remarked, "Never mind looking at those, Mr. Griffiths. Look at these. These are what I want to show you and they won't cost you any more. Just got 'em in from New York this morning." He picked up several bundles of 6 each, the very latest, as he explained. "See anything else like this anywhere around here yet?" "I'll say you haven't." He eyed Clyde smilingly, the while he wished sincerely that such a young man, so well connected, yet not rich like the others, would be friends with him. It would place him here. Clyde, fingering the offerings and guessing that what Short was saying was true, was now so troubled and confused in his own mind that he could scarcely think and speak as planned. "Very nice, sure," he said, turning them over, feeling that at another time he would have been pleased to possess at least 2. "I think maybe I'll take this one, anyhow, and this one, too." He drew out 2 and held them up, while he was thinking how to broach the so much more important matter that had brought him here. For why should he be troubling to buy ties, dilly-dallying in this way, when all he wanted to ask Short about was this other matter? Yet how hard it was now, how very hard. And yet he really must, although perhaps not so abruptly. He would look around a little more at first in order to allay suspicion, ask about some socks. Only why should he be doing that, since he did not need anything, Sandra only recently having presented him with a dozen handkerchiefs, some collars, ties and socks. Nevertheless, every time he decided to speak he felt a sort of sinking sensation at the pit of his stomach, a fear that he could not or would not carry the thing off with the necessary ease and conviction. It was all so questionable and treacherous, so likely to lead to exposure and disgrace in some way. He would probably not be able to bring himself to speak to Short tonight. And yet, as he argued with himself, how could the occasion ever be more satisfactory? Short, in the meantime having gone to the rear of the store and now returning, with a most engaging and even sycophantic smile on his face, began with, "Saw you last Tuesday evening about 9 o'clock going into the Finchleys' place, didn't I? Beautiful house and grounds they have there." Clyde saw that Short really was impressed by his social station here. There was a wealth of admiration mingled with a touch of servility. And at once, because of this, he took heart, since he realized that with such an attitude dominating the other, whatever he might say would be colored in part at least by his admirers' awe and respect. And after examining the socks and deciding that one pair at least would soften the difficulty of his demand, he added, "Oh, by the way, before I forget it, there's something I've been wanting to ask you about. Maybe you can tell me what I want to know. One of the boys at the factory, a young fellow who hasn't been married very long, about 4 months now, I guess, is in a little trouble on account of his wife." He paused, because of his uncertainty as to whether he could succeed with this now or not, seeing that Short's expression changed ever so slightly. And yet, having gone so far, he did not know how to recede. So now he laughed nervously and then added, "I don't know why they always come to me with their troubles, but I guess they think I ought to know all about these things." He laughed again, "Only I'm about as new and green here as anybody and so I'm kinda stumped. But you've been here longer than I have, I guess, and so I thought I might ask you." His manner as he said this was as nonchalant as he could make it, though while he decided now that this was a mistake, that Short would most certainly think him a fool or queer. Yet Short, taken back by the nature of the query, which he sensed as odd coming from Clyde to him, he had noted Clyde's sudden restraint and slight nervousness, was still so pleased to think that even in connection with so ticklish a thing as this, he should be made the recipient of his confidence, that he instantly recovered his former poise and affability, and replied, "Why, sure, if it's anything I can help you with, Mr. Griffiths, I'll be only too glad to. Go ahead, what is it?" "Well, it's this way," began Clyde, not a little revived by the other's hearty response, yet lowering his voice in order to give the dreadful subject its proper medium of obscurity, as it were. "His wife's already 2 months gone and he can't afford a kid yet and he doesn't know how to get rid of it. I told him last month when he first came to me to try a certain medicine that usually works this to impress Short with his own personal wisdom and resourcefulness in such situations and hence by implication to clear his own skirts, as it were, but I guess he didn't handle it right. Anyhow he's all worked up about it now and wants to see some doctor who could do something for her, you see. Only I don't know anybody here myself. Haven't been here long enough. If it were Kansas City or Chicago now," he interpolated securely, "I'd know what to do. I know 3 or 4 doctors out there." To impress Short he attempted a wise smile, "But down here it's different. And if I started asking around in my crowd and it ever got back to my relatives, they wouldn't understand. But I thought if you knew of anyone you wouldn't mind telling me. I wouldn't really bother myself, only I'm sorry for this fellow." He paused, his face, largely because of the helpful and interested expression on Short's, expressing more confidence than when he had begun. And although Short was still surprised he was more than pleased to be as helpful as he could. "You say it's been 2 months now?" "Yes. And the stuff you suggested didn't work, eh?" "No. She's tried it again this month, has she?" Yes. Well, that is bad, sure enough. I guess she's in bed all right. The trouble with this place is that I haven't been here so very long either, Mr. Griffiths. I only bought this place about a year and a half ago. Now, if I were over in Gloversville, he paused for a moment, as though, like Clyde, he too were dubious of the wisdom of entering upon details of this kind, but after a few seconds continued, you see a thing like that's not so easy, wherever you are. Doctors are always afraid of getting in trouble. I did hear once of a case over there, though, where a girl went to a doctor, a fellow who lived a couple miles out. But she was of pretty good family too, and the fellow who took her to him was pretty well known about there. So I don't know whether this doctor would do anything for a stranger, although he might at that. But I know that sort of thing is going on all the time, so you might try. If you want to send this fellow to him, tell him not to mention me or let on who sent him, 'cause I'm pretty well known around there and I wouldn't want to be mixed up in it in case anything went wrong, you see. You know how it is. And Clyde, in turn, replied gratefully, "Oh, sure, he'll understand all right. I'll tell him not to mention any names." And getting the doctor's name, he extracted a pencil and notebook from his pocket in order to be sure that the important information should not escape him. Short, sensing his relief, was inclined to wonder whether there was a working man, or whether it was not Clyde himself who was in this scrape. Why should he be speaking for a young working man at the factory? Just the same, he was glad to be of service, though at the same time he was thinking what a bit of local news this would be, assuming that any time in the future he should choose to retail it. Also that Clyde, unless he was truly playing about with some girl here who was in trouble, was foolish to be helping anybody else in this way, particularly a working man. You bet he wouldn't. Nevertheless he repeated the name, with the initials, and the exact neighborhood, as near as he could remember, giving the car stop and a description of the house. Clyde, having obtained what he desired, now thanked him, and then went out while the haberdasher looked after him genially and a little suspiciously. These rich young bloods, he thought. That's a funny request for a fellow like that to make of me. You'd think with all the people he knows and runs with here he'd know someone who would tip him off quicker than I could. Still, maybe, it's just because of them that he is afraid to ask around here. You don't know who he might have got in trouble, that young Finchley girl herself, even. You never can tell. I see him around with her occasionally, and she's gay enough. But, gee, wouldn't that be the, Chapter 37. The information thus gained was a relief, but only partially so. For both Clyde and Roberta there was no real relief now until this problem should be definitely solved. And although within a few moments after he had obtained it, he appeared and explained that at last he had secured the name of someone who might help her, still there was yet the serious business of heartening her for the task of seeing the doctor alone, also for the story that was to exculpate him and at the same time win for her sufficient sympathy to cause the doctor to make the charge for his service merely nominal. But now, instead of protesting as at first he feared that she might, Roberta was moved to acquiesce. So many things in Clyde's attitude since Christmas had so shocked her that she was bewildered and without a plan other than to extricate herself as best she might without any scandal attaching to her or him and then going her own way, pathetic and abrasive though it might be. For since he did not appear to care for her any more and plainly desired to be rid of her, she was in no mood to compel him to do other than he wished. Let him go. She could make her own way. She had, and she could too, without him, if only she could get out of this. Yet, as she said this to herself, however, and a sense of the full significance of it all came to her, the happy days that would never be again, she put her hands to her eyes and brushed away uncontrollable tears. To think that all that was should come to this. Yet when he called the same evening after visiting Short, his manner redolent of a fairly worthwhile achievement, she merely said, after listening to his explanation in as receptive a manner as she could, "Do you know just where this is, Clyde? Can we get there on the car without much trouble, or will we have to walk a long way?" And after he had explained that it was but a little way out of Gloversville, in the suburbs really, an interurban stop being but a quarter of a mile from the house, she had added, "Is he home at night, or will we have to go in the daytime? It would be so much better if we could go at night. There'd be so much less danger of anyone seeing us." And being assured that he was, as Clyde had learned from Short, she went on, "But do you know, is he old or young? I'd feel so much easier and safer if he were old. I don't like young doctors. We've always had an old doctor up home and I feel so much easier talking to someone like him." Clyde did not know. He had not thought to inquire, but to reassure her he ventured that he was middle-aged, which chanced to be the fact. The following evening the two of them departed, but separately as usual, for Fonda, where it was necessary to change cars. And once within the approximate precincts of the physician's residence, they stepped down and made their way along a road, which in this mid-state winter weather was still covered with old and dry packed snow. It offered a comparatively smooth floor for their quick steps. For in these days, there was no longer that lingering intimacy which formerly would have characterized both. In those other and so recent days, as Roberto was constantly thinking, he would have been only too glad in such a place as this, if not on such an occasion, to drag his steps, put an arm about her waist, and talk about nothing at all: the night, the work at the factory, Mr. Liggett, his uncle, the current movies, some place they were planning to go, something they would love to do together if they could. But now, and on this particular occasion, when most of all, and if ever, she needed the full strength of his devotion and support. Yet now, as she could see, he was most nervously concerned as to whether, going alone in this way, she was going to get scared and back out, whether she was going to think to say the right thing at the right time and convince the doctor that he must do something for her, and for a nominal fee. "Well, Bert, how about you? All right? You're not going to get cold feet now, are you?" "Gee, I hope not, because this is going to be a good chance to get this thing done and over with. And it isn't like you were going to someone who hadn't done anything like this before, you know, because this fellow has. I got that straight. All you have to do now, is to say, well, you know, that you're in trouble, see, and that you don't know how you're going to get out of it unless he'll help you in some way, because you haven't any friends here you can go to. And besides, as things are, you couldn't go to him if you wanted to. They'd tell on you, see. Then if he asks where I am or who I am, you just say that I was a fellow here, but that I've gone, give any name you want to, but that I've gone, and you don't know where I've gone to, run away, see. Then you'd better say, too, that you wouldn't have come to him, only that you heard of another case in which he helped someone else, that a girl told you, see. Only you don't want to let on that you're paid much, I mean, because if you do he may want to make the bill more than I can pay, see, unless he'll give us a few months in which to do it, or something like that, you see." Clyde was so nervous and so full of the necessity of charging Roberta with sufficient energy and courage to go through with this and succeed, now that he had brought her this far along with it, that he scarcely realized how inadequate and trivial, even, in so far as her predicament and the doctor's mood and temperament were concerned, his various instructions and bits of inexperienced advice were. And she on her part was not only thinking how easy it was for him to stand back and make suggestions, while she was confronted with the necessity of going forward, and that alone, but also that he was really thinking more of himself than he was of her, some way to make her get herself out of it inexpensively and without any real trouble to him. At the same time, even here and now, in spite of all this, she was still decidedly drawn to him, his white face, his thin hands, nervous manner. And although she knew he talked to encourage her to do what he had not the courage or skill to do himself, she was not angry. Rather, she was merely saying to herself in this crisis that although he advised so freely she was not going to pay attention to him, much. What she was going to say was not that she was deserted, for that seemed too much of a disagreeable and self-incriminating remark for her to make concerning herself, but rather that she was married and that she and her young husband were too poor to have a baby as yet, the same story Clyde had told the druggist in Schenectady, as she recalled. For after all, what did he know about how she felt? And he was not going with her to make it easier for her. Yet dominated by the purely feminine instinct to cling to someone for support, she now turned to Clyde, taking hold of his hands and standing quite still, wishing that he would hold and pet her and tell her that it was all right and that she must not be afraid. And although he no longer cared for her, now in the face of this involuntary evidence of her former trust in him, he released both hands and putting his arms about her, the more to encourage her than anything else, observed, "Come on now, Bert. Gee, you can't act like this, you know. You don't want to lose your nerve now that we're here, do you? It won't be so hard once you get there. I know it won't. All you got to do is to go up and ring the bell, see, and when he comes, or whoever comes, just say you want to see the doctor alone, see? Then he'll understand it's something private and it'll be easier." He went on with more advice of the same kind, and she, realizing from his lack of spontaneous enthusiasm for her at this moment how desperate was her state, drew herself together as vigorously as she could, and saying, "Well, wait here, then, will you? Don't go very far away, will you? I may be right back," hurried along in the shadow through the gate and up a walk which led to the front door. In answer to her ring, the door was opened by one of those exteriorly as well as mentally sober, small-town practitioners who, Clyde's and Short's notion to the contrary notwithstanding, was the typical and fairly conservative physician of the countryside, solemn, cautious, moral, semi-religious to a degree, holding some views which he considered liberal and others which a fairly liberal person would have considered narrow and stubborn into the bargain. Yet because of the ignorance and stupidity of so many of those about him, he was able to consider himself at least fairly learned. In constant touch with all phases of ignorance and dereliction as well as sobriety, energy, conservatism, success and the like, he was more inclined, where fact appeared to nullify his early conclusion in regard to many things, to suspend judgment between the alleged claims of heaven and hell and leave it there suspended and undisturbed. Physically he was short, stocky, bullet-headed and yet interestingly featured, with quick gray eyes and a pleasant mouth and smile. His short iron gray hair was worn bangs fashion, a bit of rural vanity. And his arms and hands, the latter fat and pudgy, yet sensitive, hung limply at his sides. He was 58, married, the father of 3 children, one of them a son already studying medicine in order to succeed to his father's practice. After showing Roberta into a littered and commonplace waiting room and asking her to remain until he had finished his dinner, he presently appeared in the door of an equally commonplace inner room, or office, where were his desk, 2 chairs, some medical instruments, books and apparently an antechamber containing other medical things, and motioned her to a chair. And because of his grayness, solidity, stolidity, as well as an odd habit he had of blinking his eyes, Roberta was not a little overawed, though by no means so unfavorably impressed as she had feared she might be. At least he was old and he seemed intelligent and conservative, if not exactly sympathetic or warm in his manner. And after looking at her curiously a moment, as though seeking to recognize someone of the immediate vicinity, he began, "Well, now who is this, please? And what can I do for you?" His voice was low and quite reassuring, a fact for which Roberta was deeply grateful. At the same time, startled by the fact that at last she had reached the place and the moment when, if ever, she must say the degrading truth about herself, she merely sat there, her eyes first upon him, then upon the floor, her fingers beginning to toy with the handle of the small bag she carried. "You see, well," she began, earnestly and nervously, her whole manner suddenly betraying the terrific strain under which she was laboring. I came. That is. I don't know whether I can tell you about myself or not. I thought I could just before I came in, but now that I am here and I see you." She paused and moved back in her chair as though to rise, at the same time that she added, "Oh, dear, how very dreadful it all is. I'm so nervous and—" "Well, now, my dear," he resumed, pleasantly and reassuringly, impressed by her attractive and yet sober appearance and wondering for the moment what could have upset so clean, modest and sedate-looking a girl, and hence not a little amused by her. "Now that I see you, just what is there about me now that you see me," he repeated after her, "that so frightens you? I am only a country doctor, you know, and I hope I'm not as dreadful as you seem to think. You can be sure that you can tell me anything you wish, anything at all about yourself, and you needn't be afraid. If there's anything I can do for you, I'll do it." He was decidedly pleasant, as she now thought, and yet so sober and reserved and probably conventional withal that what she was holding in mind to tell him would probably shock him not a little. And then what? Would he do anything for her? And if he would, how was she to arrange about money, for that certainly would be a point in connection with all this. If only Clyde or someone were here to speak for her. And yet she must speak now that she was here. She could not leave without. Once more she moved and twisted, seizing nervously on a large button of her coat to turn between her thumb and forefinger, and then went on chokingly. "But this is, well, something different, you know, maybe not what you think. I, well." Again she paused, unable to proceed, shading from white to red and back as she spoke. And because of the troubled modesty of her approach, as well as a certain clarity of eye, whiteness of forehead, sobriety of manner and dress, the doctor could scarcely bring himself to think for a moment that this was anything other than one of those morbid exhibitions of innocence, or rather inexperience, in connection with everything relating to the human body, so characteristic of the young and unsophisticated in some instances. And so he was about to repeat his customary formula in such cases that all could be told to him without fear or hesitation, whatever it might be, when a secondary thought, based on Roberta's charm and vigor, as well as her own thought waves attacking his cerebral receptive centers, caused him to decide that he might be wrong. After all, why might not this be another of those troublesome youthful cases in which possibly immorality and illegitimacy was involved? She was so young, healthy and attractive. Besides, they were always cropping up, these cases, in connection with the most respectable-looking girls at times. And invariably they spelled trouble and distress for doctors. And, for various reasons connected with his own temperament, which was retiring and recessive, as well as the nature of this local social world, he disliked and hesitated to even trifle with them. They were legal, dangerous, involved little or no pay as a rule, and the sentiment of this local world was all against them, as he knew. Besides, he personally was more or less irritated by these young scamps of boys and girls who were so free to exercise the normal functions of their natures in the first instance, but so ready to refuse the social obligations which went with them, marriage afterwards. And so, although in several cases in the past 10 years where family and other neighborhood and religious considerations had made it seem quite advisable, he had assisted in extricating from the consequences of their folly several young girls of good family who had fallen from grace and could not otherwise be rescued, still he was opposed to aiding, either by his own countenance or skill, any lapses or tangles not heavily sponsored by others. It was too dangerous. Ordinarily it was his custom to advise immediate and unconditional marriage. Or, where that was not possible, the perpetrator of the infamy having decamped, it was his general and self-consciously sanctioned practice to have nothing at all to do with the matter. It was too dangerous and ethically and socially wrong and criminal into the bargain. In consequence he now looked at Roberta in an extremely sober manner. By no means, he now said to himself, must he allow himself to become emotionally or otherwise involved here. And so, in order to help himself as well as her to attain and maintain a balance which would permit of both extricating themselves without too much trouble, he drew toward him his black leather case record book and, opening it, said, "Now, let's see if we can't find out what the trouble is here. What is your name?" "Ruth Howard." "Mrs. Howard," replied Roberta nervously and tensely, at once fixing upon a name which Clyde had suggested for her use. And now, interestingly enough, at mention of the fact that she was married, he breathed easier. But why the tears then? What reason could a young married woman have for being so intensely shy and nervous? And your husband's first name? He went on. As simple as the question was, and as easy as it should have been to answer, Roberta nevertheless hesitated before she could bring herself to say, Gifford, her older brother's name. You live around her, I presume? In Fonda. Yes. And how old are you? 22. How long have you been married? This inquiry being so intimately connected with the problem before her, she again hesitated before saying, let me see, 3 months. At once Dr. Glenn became dubious again, though he gave her no sign. Her hesitancy arrested him. Why the uncertainty? He was wondering now again whether he was dealing with a truthful girl or whether his first suspicions were being substantiated. In consequence he now asked, well, now what seems to be the trouble, Mrs. Howard? You need have no hesitancy in telling me, none whatsoever. I am used to such things year in and out, whatever they are. That is my business, listening to the troubles of people. Well, began Roberta, nervously once more, this terrible confession drying her throat and thickening her tongue almost, while once more she turned the same button of her coat and gazed at the floor. It's like this. You see. My husband hasn't much money. And I have to work to help out with expenses and neither of us make so very much. She was astonishing herself with her own shameful power to lie in this instance, she, who had always hated to lie, so. Of course. We can't afford to have. Well, any children, you see, so soon, anyhow, and. She paused, her breath catching, and really unable to proceed further with this wholesale lying. The doctor realizing from this, as he thought, what the true problem was, that she was a newly married girl who was probably faced by just such a problem as she was attempting to outline, yet not wishing to enter upon any form of malpractice and at the same time not wishing to appear too discouraging to a young couple just starting out in life, gazed at her somewhat more sympathetically, the decidedly unfortunate predicament of these young people, as well as her appropriate modesty in the face of such a conventionally delicate situation, appealing to him. It was too bad. Young people these days did have a rather hard time of it, getting started in some cases, anyhow. And they were no doubt faced by some pressing financial situations. Nearly all young people were. Nevertheless, this business of a contraceptal operation or interference with the normal or God-arranged life processes, well, that was a ticklish and unnatural business at best which he wanted as little as possible to do with. Besides, young, healthy people, even though poor, when they undertook marriage, knew what they were about. And it was not impossible for them to work, the husband anyhow, and hence manage in some way. And now straightening himself around in his chair very soberly and authoritatively, he began, I think I understand what you want to say to me, Mrs. Howard. But I'm also wondering if you have considered what a very serious and dangerous thing it is you have in mind. But, he added, suddenly, another thought as to whether his own reputation in this community was in any way being tarnished by a rumor of anything he had done in the past coming to him. Just how did you happen to come to me, anyhow? Something about the tone of his voice, the manner in which he asked the question, the caution of it as well as the possibly impending resentment in case it should turn out that anyone suspected him of a practice of this sort, caused Roberta to hesitate and to feel that any statement to the effect that she had heard of or been sent by anyone else, Clyde to the contrary notwithstanding, might be dangerous. Perhaps she had better not say that she had been sent by anyone. He might resent it as an insult to his character as a reputable physician. A budding instinct for diplomacy helped her in this instance, and she replied, I've noticed your sign in passing several times and I've heard different people say you were a good doctor. His uncertainty allayed, he now continued, in the first place, the thing you want done is something my conscience would not permit me to advise. I understand, of course, that you consider it necessary. You and your husband are both young and you probably haven't very much money to go on, and you both feel that an interruption of this kind will be a great strain in every way, and no doubt it will be. Still, as I see it, Marriage is a very sacred thing, and children are a blessing, not a curse. And when you went to the altar 3 months ago, you were probably not unaware that you might have to face just such a situation as this. All young married people are, I think. The altar, thought Roberta sadly. If only it were so. Now I know that the tendency of the day in some quarters is very much in this direction, I am sorry to say. There are those who feel it quite all right if they can shirk the normal responsibilities in such cases as to perform these operations, but it's very dangerous, Mrs. Howard, very dangerous legally and ethically as well as medically, very wrong. Many women who seek to escape childbirth die in this way. Besides, it is a prison offense for any doctor to assist them, whether there are bad consequences or not. You know that, I suppose. At any rate, I, for one, am heartily opposed to this sort of thing from every point of view. The only excuse I have ever been able to see for it is when the life of the mother, for instance, depends upon such an operation. Not otherwise. And in such cases the medical profession is in accord. But in this instance I'm sure the situation isn't one which warrants anything like that. You seem to me to be a strong, healthy girl. Motherhood should hold no serious consequences for you. And as for money reasons, don't you really think now that if you just go ahead and have this baby, you and your husband would find means of getting along? You say your husband is an electrician? Yes, replied Roberta, nervously, not a little overawed and subdued by his solemn moralizing. Well, now, there you are, he went on. That's not such an unprofitable profession. At least all electricians charge enough. And when you consider, as you must, how serious a thing you are thinking of doing, that you are actually planning to destroy a young life that has as good a right to its existence as you have to yours. He paused in order to let the substance of what he was saying sink in. Well, then, I think you might feel called upon to stop and consider, both you and your husband. Besides, he added, in a diplomatic and more fatherly and even intriguing tone of voice, I think that once you have it, it will more than make up to you both for whatever little hardship its coming will bring you. Tell me, he added curiously at this point, does your husband know of this? Or is this just some plan of yours to save him and yourself from too much hardship? He almost beamed cheerfully as, fancying he had captured Roberta in some purely nervous and feminine economy as well as dread, he decided that if so he could easily extract her from her present mood. And she, sensing his present drift and feeling that one lie more or less could neither help nor harm her, replied quickly, he knows. Well, then, he went on, slightly reduced by the fact that his surmise was incorrect, but nonetheless resolved to dissuade her and him, too. I think you two should really consider very seriously before you go further in this matter. I know when young people first face a situation like this they always look on the darkest side of it, but it doesn't always work out that way. I know my wife and I did with our first child. But we got along. And if you will only stop now and talk it over, you'll see it in a different light, I'm sure. And then you won't have your conscience to deal with afterwards, either. He ceased, feeling reasonably sure that he had dispelled the fear, as well as the determination that had brought Roberta to him, that, being a sensible, ordinary wife, she would now desist of course, think nothing more of her plan and leave. But instead of either acquiescing cheerfully or rising to go, as he thought she might, she gave him a wide-eyed terrified look and then as instantly burst into tears. For the total effect of his address had been to first revive more clearly than ever the normal social or conventional aspect of the situation which all along she was attempting to shut out from her thoughts and which, under ordinary circumstances, assuming that she was really married, was exactly the attitude she would have taken. But now the realization that her problem was not to be solved at all, by this man at least, caused her to be seized with what might best be described as morbid panic. Suddenly beginning to open and shut her fingers and at the same time beating her knees, while her face contorted itself with pain and terror, she exclaimed, "But you don't understand, doctor, you don't understand. I have to get out of this in some way. I have to. It isn't like I told you at all. I'm not married. I haven't any husband at all. But, oh, you don't know what this means to me. My family. My father. My mother. I can't tell you. But I must get out of it. I must. I must. Oh, you don't know, you don't know. I must. I must. She began to rock backward and forward, at the same time swaying from side to side as in a trance. And Glenn, surprised and startled by this sudden demonstration as well as emotionally affected, and yet at the same time advised thereby that his original surmise had been correct, and hence that Roberta had been lying, as well as that if he wished to keep himself out of this he must now assume a firm and even heartless attitude, asked solemnly, "You are not married, you say?" For answer now Roberta merely shook her head negatively and continued to cry. And at last, gathering the full import of her situation, Dr. Glenn got up, his face a study of troubled and yet conservative caution and sympathy. But without saying anything at first he merely looked at her as she wept. Later he added, well, this is too bad. I'm sorry." But fearing to commit himself in any way, he merely paused, adding after a time soothingly and dubiously, "You mustn't cry. That won't help you any." He then paused again, still determined not to have anything to do with this case. Yet a bit curious as to the true nature of the story he finally asked, "Well, then where is the young man who is the cause of your trouble? Is he here?" Still too overcome by shame and despair to speak, Roberta merely shook her head negatively. "But he knows that you're in trouble, doesn't he?" "Yes," replied Roberta faintly. "And he won't marry you? He's gone away." "Oh, I see. The young scamp. And don't you know where he's gone?" "No," lied Roberta, weakly. "How long has it been since he left you?" "About a week now." Once more she lied. "And you don't know where he is?" "No." "How long has it been since you were sick?" "Over 2 weeks now," sobbed Roberta. "And before that you have always been regular?" "Yes." "Well, in the first place, his tone was more comfortable and pleasant than before. He seemed to be snatching at a plausible excuse for extricating himself from a case which promised little other than danger and difficulty. "This may not be as serious as you think. I know you're probably very much frightened, but it's not unusual for women to miss a period. At any rate, without an examination it wouldn't be possible to be sure, and even if you were, the most advisable thing would be to wait another 2 weeks. You may find then that there is nothing wrong. I wouldn't be surprised if you did. You seem to be oversensitive and nervous, and that sometimes brings about delays of this kind, mere nervousness. At any rate, if you'll take my advice, whatever you do, you'll not do anything now but just go home and wait until you're really sure. For even if anything were to be done, it wouldn't be advisable for you to do anything before then." "But I've already taken some pills and they haven't helped me," pleaded Roberta. "What were they?" asked Glenn interestedly, and, after he had learned, merely commented, "Oh, those. Well, they wouldn't be likely to be of any real service to you, if you were pregnant. But I still suggest that you wait, and if you find you pass your second period, then it will be time enough to act, although I earnestly advise you, even then, to do nothing if you can help it, because I consider it wrong to interfere with nature in this way. It would be much better, if you would arrange to have the child and take care of it. Then you wouldn't have the additional sin of destroying a life upon your conscience." He was very grave and felt very righteous as he said this. But Roberta, faced by terrors which he did not appear to be able to grasp, merely exclaimed, and as dramatically as before, "But I can't do that, doctor, I tell you. I can't. I can't. You don't understand. Oh, I don't know what I shall do unless I find some way out of this. I don't. I don't. I don't." She shook her head and clenched her fingers and rocked to and fro while Glenn, impressed by her own terrors, the pity of the folly which, as he saw it, had led her to this dreadful pass, yet professionally alienated by a type of case that spelled nothing but difficulty for him, stood determinedly before her and added, "As I told you before, miss," he paused, "Howard, if that is your name, I am seriously opposed to operations of this kind, just as I am to the folly that brings girls and young men to the point where they seem to think they are necessary. A physician may not interfere in a case of this kind unless he is willing to spend 10 years in prison, and I think that law is fair enough. Not that I don't realize how painful your present situation appears to you. But there are always those who are willing to help a girl in your state, providing she doesn't wish to do something which is morally and legally wrong. And so the very best advice I can give you now is that you do nothing at all now or at any time. Better go home and see your parents and confess. It will be much better, I assure you. Not nearly as hard as you think or as wicked as this other way. Don't forget there is a life there, a human, if it is really as you think. A human life which you are seeking to end, and that I cannot help you to do. I really cannot. There may be doctors, I know there are, men here and there who take their professional ethics a little less seriously than I do, but I cannot let myself become one of them. I am sorry, very. So now the best I can say is, go home to your parents and tell them. It may look hard now, but you are going to feel better about it in the long run. If it will make you or them feel any better about it, let them come and talk to me. I will try and make them see that this is not the worst thing in the world, either. But as for doing what you want, I am very, very sorry, but I cannot. My conscience will not permit me. He paused and gazed at her sympathetically, yet with a determined and concluded look in his eye. And Roberta, dumbfounded by this sudden termination of all her hopes in connection with him, and realizing at last that not only had she been misled by Clyde's information in regard to this doctor, but that her technical as well as emotional plea had failed, now walked unsteadily to the door, the terrors of the future crowding thick upon her. And once outside in the dark, after the doctor had most courteously and ruefully closed the door behind her, she paused to lean against a tree that was there, her nervous and physical strength all but failing her. He had refused to help her. He had refused to help her. And now what? Chapter 38. The first effect of the doctor's decision was to shock and terrify them both, Roberta and Clyde, beyond measure. For apparently now here was a legitimacy and disgrace for Roberta. Exposure and destruction for Clyde. And this had been their one solution seemingly. Then, by degrees, for Clyde at least, there was a slight lifting of the heavy pall. Perhaps, after all, as the doctor had suggested, and once she had recovered her senses sufficiently to talk, she had told him, the end had not been reached. There was the bare possibility, as suggested by the druggist, Short, and the doctor, that she might be mistaken. And this, while not producing a happy reaction in her, had the unsatisfactory result of inducing in Clyde a lethargy based more than anything else on the ever-haunting fear of inability to cope with this situation, as well as the certainty of social exposure in case he did not, which caused him, instead of struggling all the more desperately, to defer further immediate action. For, such was his nature that, although he realized clearly the probably tragic consequences if he did not act, still it was so hard to think to whom else to apply to without danger to himself. To think that the doctor had turned her down, as he phrased it, and that Short's advice should have been worth as little as that. But apart from nervous thoughts as to whom to turn to next, no particular individual occurred to him before the 2 weeks were gone, or after. It was so hard to just ask anywhere. One just couldn't do it. Besides, of whom could he ask now? Of whom? These things took time, didn't they? Yet in the meantime, the days going by, both he and Roberta had ample time to consider what, if any, steps they must take, the one in regard to the other, in case no medical or surgical solution was found. For Roberta, while urging and urging, if not so much by words as by expression and mood at her work, was determined that she must not be left to fight this out alone. She could not be. On the other hand, as she could see, Clyde did nothing. For apart from what he had already attempted to do, he was absolutely at a loss how to proceed. He had no intimates, and in consequence he could only think of presenting the problem as an imaginary one to one individual and another here or there in the hope of extracting some helpful information. At the same time, and as impractical and evasive as it may seem, there was the call of that diverting world of which Sandra was a part, evenings and Sundays, when, in spite of Roberta's wretched state and mood, he was called to go here and there, and did, because in so doing he was actually relieving his own mind of the dread specter of disaster that was almost constantly before it. If only he could get her out of this. If only he could. But how, without money, intimates a more familiar understanding of the medical, or if not that exactly, than the sub-rosa world of sexual Freemasonry which some at times, the bellhops of the Green Davidson, for instance, seemed to understand. He had written to Ratterer, of course, but there had been no answer, since Ratterer had removed to Florida and as yet Clyde's letter had not reached him. And locally all those he knew best were either connected with the factory or society, individuals on the one hand too inexperienced or dangerous, or on the other hand, too remote and dangerous, since he was not sufficiently intimate with any of them as yet to command their true confidence and secrecy. At the same time he must do something, he could not just rest and drift. Assuredly Roberta could not long permit him to do that, faced as she was by exposure. And so from time to time he actually racked himself, seized upon straws and what would have been looked upon by most as forlorn chances. Thus, for instance, an associate foreman, chancing to reminisce one day concerning a certain girl in his department who had gotten in trouble and had been compelled to leave, he had been given the opportunity to inquire what he thought such a girl did in case she could not afford or did not want to have a child. But this particular foreman, being as uninformed as himself, merely observed that she probably had to see a doctor if she knew one or go through with it, which left Clyde exactly where he was. On another occasion, in connection with a conversation in a barber shop, relating to a local case reported in the Star where a girl was suing a local ne'er-do-well for breach of promise, the remark was made that she would never have sued that guy, you bet, unless she had to. Whereupon Clyde seized the opportunity to remark hopefully, but wouldn't you think that she could find some way of getting out of trouble without marrying a fella she didn't like? Well, that's not so easy as you may think, particularly around here, elucidated the wiseacre who was trimming his hair. In the first place it's agin the law. And next it takes a lot of money. And in case you ain't got it, well, money makes the mare go, you know. He snipped with his scissors while Clyde, confronted by his own problem, meditated on how true it was. If he had a lot of money, even a few $100s, he might take it now and possibly persuade her, who could tell, to go somewhere by herself and have an operation performed. Yet each day, as on the one before, he was saying to himself that he must find someone. And Roberta was saying to herself that she too must act, must not really depend on Clyde any longer if he were going to act so. One could not trifle or compromise with a terror of this kind. It was a cruel imposition on her. It must be that Clyde did not realize how terribly this affected her and even him. For certainly, if he were not going to help her out of it, as he had distinctly said he would do at first, then decidedly she could not be expected to weather the subsequent storm alone. Never, never, never. For, after all, as Roberta saw it, Clyde was a man, he had a good position, it was not he, but she, who was in this treacherous position and unable to extricate herself alone. And beginning with the second day after the second period, when she discovered for once and all that her worst suspicions were true, she not only emphasized the fact in every way that she could that she was distressed beyond all words, but on the third day announced to him in a note that she was again going to see the doctor near Gloversville that evening, regardless of his previous refusal, so great was her need, and also asking Clyde whether he would accompany her, a request which, since he had not succeeded in doing anything, and although he had an engagement with Sandra, he instantly acceded to, feeling it to be of greater importance than anything else. He must excuse himself to Sandra on the ground of work. And accordingly this second trip was made, a long and nervous conversation between himself and Roberta on the way resulting in nothing more than some explanations as to why thus far he had not been able to achieve anything, plus certain encomiums addressed to her concerning her courage in acting for herself in this way. Yet the doctor again would not and did not act. After waiting nearly an hour for his return from somewhere, she was merely permitted to tell him of her unchanged state and her destroying fears in regard to herself, but with no hint from him that he could be induced to act as indeed he could act. It was against his prejudices and ethics. And so once more Roberta returned, this time not crying, actually too sad to cry, choked with the weight of her impending danger and the anticipatory fears and miseries that attended it. And Clyde, hearing of this defeat, was at last reduced to a nervous, gloomy silence, absolutely devoid of a helpful suggestion. He could not think what to say and was chiefly fearful lest Roberta now make some demand with which socially or economically he could not comply. However, in regard to this she said little on the way home. Instead she sat and stared out of the window, thinking of her defenseless predicament that was becoming more real and terrible to her hourly. By way of excuse she pleaded that she had a headache. She wanted to be alone, only to think more, to try to work out a solution. She must work out some way. That she knew. But what? How? What could she do? How could she possibly escape? She felt like a cornered animal fighting for its life with all odds against it, and she thought of 1,000 remote and entirely impossible avenues of escape, only to return to the one and only safe and sound solution that she really felt should be possible, and that was marriage. And why not? Hadn't she given him all, and that against her better judgment? Hadn't he over-persuaded her? Who was he anyway to so cast her aside? For decidedly at times, and especially since this latest crisis had developed, his manner, because of Sandra and the Griffiths and what he felt to be the fatal effect of all this on his dreams here, was sufficient to make plain that love was decidedly dead, and that he was not thinking nearly so much of the meaning of her state to her, as he was of its import to him, the injury that was most certain to accrue to him. And when this did not completely terrify her, as mostly it did, it served to irritate and slowly develop the conclusion that in such a desperate state as this, she was justified in asking more than ordinarily she would have dreamed of asking, marriage itself, since there was no other door. And why not? Wasn't her life as good as his? And hadn't he joined his to hers, voluntarily? Then, why shouldn't he strive to help her now, or, failing that, make this final sacrifice which was the only one by which she could be rescued apparently? For who were all the society people with whom he was concerned anyhow? And why should he ask her in such a crisis to sacrifice herself, her future and good name, just because of his interest in them? They had never done anything very much for him, certainly not as much as had she. And, just because he was wearying now, after persuading her to do his bidding, was that any reason why now, in this crisis, he should be permitted to desert her? After all, wouldn't all of these society people in whom he was so much interested feel that whatever his relationship to them, she would be justified in taking the course which she might be compelled to take? She brooded on this much, more especially on the return from this second attempt to induce Dr. Glenn to help her. In fact, at moments, her face took on a defiant, determined look which was seemingly new to her, but which only developed suddenly under such pressure. Her jaw became a trifle set. She had made a decision. He would have to marry her. She must make him if there were no other way out of this. She must. Think of her home, her mother, Grace Marr, the Newtons, all who knew her in fact, the terror and pain and shame with which this would sear all those in any way identified with her, her father, brothers, sisters. Impossible. Impossible. It must not and could not be. Impossible. It might seem a little severe to her, even now, to have to insist on this, considering all the emphasis Clyde had hitherto laid upon his prospects here. But how else was she to do? Accordingly the next day, and not a little to his surprise, since for so many hours the night before they had been together, Clyde received another note telling him that he must come again that night. She had something to say to him, and there was something in the tone of the note that seemed to indicate or suggest a kind of defiance of a refusal of any kind, hitherto absent in any of her communications to him. And at once the thought that this situation, unless cleared away, was certain to prove disastrous, so weighed upon him that he could not but put the best face possible on it and consent to go and hear what it was that she had to offer in the way of a solution, or, on the other hand, of what she had to complain. Going to her room at a late hour, he found her in what seemed to him a more composed frame of mind than at any time since this difficulty had appeared, a state which surprised him a little, since he had expected to find her in tears. But now, if anything, she appeared more complacent, her nervous thoughts as to how to bring about a satisfactory conclusion for herself having called into play a native shrewdness which was now seeking to exercise itself. And so directly before announcing what was in her mind, she began by asking, "You haven't found out about another doctor, have you, Clyde, or thought of anything?" "No, I haven't, Bert," he replied most dismally and wearisomely, his own mental tether length having been strained to the breaking point. "I've been trying to, as you know, but it's so darn hard to find anyone who isn't afraid to monkey with a case like this. Honest, to tell the truth, Bert, I'm about stumped. I don't know what we are going to do unless you can think of something. You haven't thought or heard of anyone else you could go to, have you?" For, during the conversation that had immediately followed her first visit to the doctor, he had hinted to her that by striking up a fairly intimate relationship with one of the foreign family girls, she might by degrees extract some information there which would be of use to both. But Roberta was not of a temperament that permitted of any such facile friendships, and nothing had come of it. However, his stating that he was stumped now gave her the opportunity she was really desiring, to present the proposition which she felt to be unavoidable and not longer to be delayed. Yet being fearful of how Clyde would react, she hesitated as to the form in which she would present it, and, after shaking her head and manifesting a nervousness which was real enough, she finally said, "Well, I'll tell you, Clyde. I've been thinking about it and I don't see any way out of it unless you, well, marry me. It's 2 months now, you know, and unless we get married right away, everybody'll know, won't they?" Her manner as she said this was a mixture of outward courage born out of her conviction that she was in the right and an inward uncertainty about Clyde's attitude, which was all the more fused by a sudden look of surprise, resentment, uncertainty and fear that now transformation-wise played over his countenance, a variation and play which, if it indicated anything definite, indicated that she was seeking to inflict an unwarranted injury on him. For since he had been drawing closer and closer to Sandra, his hopes had heightened so intensely that, hearkening to this demand on the part of Roberta now, his brow wrinkled and his manner changed from one of comparatively affable, if nervous, consideration to that of mingled fear, opposition as well as determination to evade drastic consequence. For this would spell complete ruin for him, the loss of Sandra, his job, his social hopes and ambitions in connection with the Griffiths, all, a thought which sickened and at the same time caused him to hesitate about how to proceed. But he would not. He would not. He would not do this. Never. 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 Yet after a moment he exclaimed equivocally, "Well, gee, that's all right, too, Bert, for you, because that fixes everything without any trouble at all. But what about me? You don't want to forget that that isn't going to be easy for me, the way things are now. You know I haven't any money. All I have is my job. And besides, the family don't know anything about you yet, not a thing. And if it should suddenly come out now that we've been going together all this time, and that this has happened, and that I was going to have to get married right away, well, gee, they'll know I've been fooling 'em and they're sure to get sore. And then what? They might even fire me." He paused to see what effect this explanation would have, but noting the somewhat dubious expression which of late characterized Roberta's face whenever he began excusing himself, he added hopefully and evasively, seeking by any trick that he could to delay this sudden issue, "Besides, I'm not so sure that I can't find a doctor yet, either. I haven't had much luck so far, But that's not saying that I won't. And there's a little time yet, isn't there? Sure there is. It's all right up to 3 months anyway. He had since had a letter from Ratterer who had commented on this fact, and I did hear something the other day of a doctor over in Albany who might do it. Anyway, I thought I'd go over and see before I said anything about him. His manner, when he said this, was so equivocal that Roberta could tell he was merely lying to gain time. There was no doctor in Albany. Besides, it was so plain that he resented her suggestion and was only thinking of some way of escaping it. And she knew well enough that at no time had he said directly that he would marry her. And while she might urge, in the last analysis she could not force him to do anything. He might just go away alone, as he had once said in connection with inadvertently losing his job because of her. And how much greater might not his impulse in that direction now be, if this world here in which he was so much interested were taken away from him, and he were to face the necessity of taking her and a child, too. It made her more cautious and caused her to modify her first impulse to speak out definitely and forcefully, however great her necessity might be. And so disturbed was he by the panorama of the bright world of which Sandra was the center and which was now at stake, that he could scarcely think clearly. Should he lose all this for such a world as he and Roberta could provide for themselves, a small home, a baby, such a routine workaday life as taking care of her and a baby on such a salary as he could earn, and from which most likely he would never again be freed? God! A sense of nausea seized him. He could not and would not do this. And yet, as he now saw, all his dreams could be so easily tumbled about his ears by her and because of one false step on his part. It made him cautious and for the first time in his life caused tact and cunning to visualize itself as a profound necessity. And at the same time, Clyde was sensing inwardly and somewhat shamefacedly all of this profound change in himself. But Roberta was saying, "Oh, I know, Clyde, but you yourself said just now that you were stumped, didn't you? And every day that goes by just makes it so much the worse for me, if we're not going to be able to get a doctor. You can't get married and have a child born within a few months, you know that. Everyone in the world would know. Besides, I have myself to consider as well as you know. And the baby, too." At the mere mention of a coming child Clyde winced and recoiled as though he had been slapped. She noted it. "I just must do one of two things right away, Clyde, get married or get out of this, and you don't seem to be able to get me out of it, do you? If you're so afraid of what your uncle might think or do in case we get married," she added nervously and yet suavely, "why couldn't we get married right away and then keep it a secret for a while, as long as we could, or as long as you thought we ought to," she added shrewdly. "Meanwhile I could go home and tell my parents about it, that I am married, but that it must be kept a secret for a while. Then when the time came, when things got so bad that we couldn't stay here any longer without telling, why we could either go away somewhere, if we wanted to, that is, if you didn't want your uncle to know, or we could just announce that we were married some time ago. Lots of young couples do that nowadays. And as for getting along," she went on, noting a sudden dour shadow that passed over Clyde's face like a cloud, "why we could always find something to do, I know I could, anyhow, once the baby is born." When first she began to speak, Clyde had seated himself on the edge of the bed, listening nervously and dubiously to all she had to offer. However, when she came to that part which related to marriage and going away, he got up, an irresistible impulse to move overcoming him. And when she concluded with the commonplace suggestion of going to work as soon as the baby was born, he looked at her with little less than panic in his eyes. To think of marrying and being in a position where it would be necessary to do that, when with a little luck and without interference from her, he might marry Sandra. "Oh, yes, that's all right for you, Bert. That fixes everything up for you, but how about me? Why, gee whiz, I've only got started here now as it is, and if I have to pack up and get out, and I would have to, if ever they found out about this, why I don't know what I'd do. I haven't any business or trade that I could turn my hand to. It might go hard with both of us. Besides, my uncle gave me this chance because I begged him to, and if I walked off now he never would do anything for me." In his excitement he was forgetting that at one time and another in the past he had indicated to Roberta that the state of his own parents was not wholly unprosperous, and that if things did not go just to his liking here, he could return west and perhaps find something to do out there. And it was some general recollection of this that now caused her to ask, "Couldn't we go out to Denver or something like that? Wouldn't your father be willing to help you get something for a time, anyhow?" Her tone was very soft and pleading, an attempt to make Clyde feel that things could not be as bad as he was imagining. But the mere mention of his father in connection with all this, the assumption that he, of all people, might prove an escape from drudgery for them both, was a little too much. It showed how dreadfully incomplete was her understanding of his true position in this world. Worse, she was looking for help from that quarter. And, not finding it, later might possibly reproach him for that, who could tell, for his lies in connection with it. It made so very clear now the necessity for frustrating, if possible, and that at once, any tendency toward this idea of marriage. It could not be, ever. And yet how was he to oppose this ideal with safety, since she felt that she had this claim on him? How say to her openly and coldly that he could not and would not marry her? And unless he did so now she might think it would be fair and legitimate enough for her to compel him to do so. She might even feel privileged to go to his uncle, his cousin, he could see Gilbert's cold eyes, and expose him. And then destruction. Ruin. The end of all his dreams in connection with Sandra and everything else here. But all he could think of saying now was, "But I can't do this, Bert, not now, anyway." A remark which at once caused Roberta to assume that the idea of marriage, as she had interjected it here, was not one which, under the circumstances, he had the courage to oppose, his saying, "Not now, anyway." Yet even as she was thinking this, he went swiftly on with, "Besides, I don't want to get married so soon. It means too much to me at this time. In the first place, I'm not old enough and I haven't got anything to get married on. And I can't leave here. I couldn't do half as well anywhere else. You don't realize what this chance means to me. My father's all right, but he couldn't do what my uncle could, and he wouldn't. You don't know, or you wouldn't ask me to do this." He paused, his face a picture of puzzled fear and opposition. He was not unlike a harried animal, deftly pursued by hunter and hound. But Roberta, imagining that his total defection had been caused by the social side of Lycurgus as opposed to her own low state and not because of the superior lure of any particular girl, now retorted resentfully, although she desired not to appear so, "Oh, yes, I know well enough why you can't leave. It isn't your position here, though, half as much as it is those society people you are always running around with. I know. You don't care for me anymore, Clyde. That's it, and you don't want to give these other people up for me. I know that's it and nothing else. But just the same, it wasn't so very long ago that you did, although you don't seem to remember it now." Her cheeks burned and her eyes flamed as she said this. She paused a moment while he gazed at her, wondering about the outcome of all this. "But you can't leave me to make out any way I can, just the same, because I won't be left this way, Clyde. I can't. I can't. I tell you." She grew tense and staccato, "It means too much to me. I don't know how to do alone, and I, besides, have no one to turn to but you, and you must help me. I've got to get out of this, that's all, Clyde, I've got to. I'm not going to be left to face my people and everybody without any help or marriage or anything." As she said this, her eyes turned appealingly and yet savagely toward him, and she emphasized it all with her hands, which she clenched and unclenched in a dramatic way. "And if you can't help me out in the way you thought," she went on most agonizedly as Clyde could see, "then you've got to help me out in this other, that's all. At least until I can do for myself I just won't be left. I don't ask you to marry me forever," she now added, the thought that if by presenting this demand in some modified form, she could induce Clyde to marry her, It might be possible afterwards that his feeling toward her would change to a much more kindly one. You can leave me after a while if you want to. After I'm out of this. I can't prevent you from doing that, and I wouldn't want to if I could. But you can't leave me now. You can't. You can't. Besides, she added, I didn't want to get myself in this position, and I wouldn't have, but for you. But you made me and made me let you come in here. And now you want to leave me to shift for myself, just because you think you won't be able to go in society anymore, if they find out about me. She paused, the strain of this contest proving almost too much for her tired nerves. At the same time she began to sob nervously and yet not violently, a marked effort at self-restraint and recovery marking her every gesture. And after a moment or two in which both stood there, he gazing dumbly and wondering what else he was to say in answer to all this, she struggling and finally managing to recover her poise, she added, Oh, what is it about me that's so different to what I was a couple of months ago, Clyde? Will you tell me that? I'd like to know. What is it that has caused you to change so? Up to Christmas, almost, you were as nice to me as any human being could be. You were with me nearly all the time you had, and since then I've scarcely had an evening that I didn't beg for. Who is it? What is it? Some other girl, or what, I'd like to know, that Sandra Finchley or Bertine Cranston, or who? Her eyes as she said this were a study. For even to this hour, as Clyde could now see to his satisfaction, since he feared the effect on Roberta of definite and absolute knowledge concerning Sandra, she had no specific suspicion, let alone positive knowledge concerning any girl. And coward-wise, in the face of her present predicament and her assumed and threatened claims on him, he was afraid to say what or who the real cause of this change was. Instead he merely replied, and almost unmoved by her sorrow, since he no longer really cared for her, Oh, you're all wrong, Bert. You don't see what the trouble is. It's my future here. If I leave here I certainly will never find such an opportunity. And if I have to marry in this way or leave here it will all go fluey. I want to wait and get some place first before I marry, save some money, and if I do this I won't have a chance and you won't either, he added feebly, forgetting for the moment that up to this time he had been indicating rather clearly that he did not want to have anything more to do with her in any way. Besides, he continued, if you could only find someone, or if you would go away by yourself somewhere for a while, Bert, and go through with this alone, I could send you the money to do it on, I know. I could have it between now and the time you had to go. His face, as he said this, and as Roberta clearly saw, mirrored the complete and resourceless collapse of all his recent plans in regard to her. And she, realizing that his indifference to her had reached the point where he could thus dispose of her and their prospective baby in this casual and really heartless manner, was not only angered in part, but at the same time frightened by the meaning of it all. Oh, Clyde, she now exclaimed boldly and with more courage and defiance than at any time since she had known him, how you have changed. And how hard you can be. To want me to go off all by myself and just to save you, so you can stay here and get along and marry someone here when I am out of the way and you don't have to bother about me anymore. Well, I won't do it. It's not fair. And I won't, that's all. I won't. And that's all there is to it. You can get someone to get me out of this, or you can marry me and come away with me, at least long enough for me to have the baby and place myself right before my people and everyone else that knows me. I don't care if you leave me afterwards, because I see now that you really don't care for me anymore, and if that's the way you feel, I don't want you any more than you want me. But just the same, you must help me now, you must. But, oh, dear, she began whimpering again, and yet only slightly and bitterly. To think that all our love for each other should have come to this, that I am asked to go away by myself, all alone, with no one, while you stay here, oh, dear. Oh, dear. And with a baby on my hands afterwards. And no husband. She clenched her hands and shook her head bleakly. Clyde, Realizing well enough that his proposition certainly was cold and indifferent, but, in the face of his intense desire for Sandra, the best or at least safest that he could devise, now stood there unable for the moment to think of anything more to say. And although there was some other discussion to the same effect, the conclusion of this very difficult hour was that Clyde had another week or two at best in which to see if he could find a physician or anyone who would assist him. After that, the implied, if not openly expressed, threat which lay at the bottom of this was, unless so extricated and speedily, that he would have to marry her, if not permanently, then at least temporarily, but legally just the same, until once again she was able to look after herself, a threat which was as crushing and humiliating to Roberta as it was torturing to him.